Hi, I'm G, welcome to my art channel, and today I'm showing you how to draw this green succulent plant using Derwent watercolor pencils. So first of all, I pencil the actual flower out, and if that doesn't look too clear to you, there's a reason. It's because I drew it out with a watercolor pencil, a pale green watercolor pencil, not the graphite that I'd normally use. And then I do my usual start of going in on a small manageable part of the picture first, just to make sure that everything's going to work and all the colours are going to blend. And you can see me start with emerald green Derwent watercolor pencil there. So I'm putting my lightest colour on first. Then you can see me switch up to a slightly darker green. This one's called mineral green. And I popped up a picture on the screen there so you can see exactly which of the petals on this succulent that I'm currently trying to shade in with the colours. It's that very, very middle one with a little spiky bit sort of pointing out to the left. And since it's the start of the drawing, I'm not putting a lot of colour on straight away. You can see I'm really just putting a light layer of these colours on. And then what I can do is I can add the water, I can sort of move it all around, blend all the colours with the water, see if it looks dark or too light, and then adapt it later as well. So now you can see me putting on a darker shade of blue. This is spectrum blue. And then when I'm done with the spectrum blue, you see me adding my fourth and my last dark colour here, and that is blue-grey. So those are the colours that I want to use, starting with my lightest and then ending with my darkest, and now it's ready to start adding some water and giving it that watercolour look. So I'm using a size 3 brush here. This is a Sable brush, Sable watercolour brush by WINSOR and Newton. And it's got a nice fine delicate tip which allows me to get in there and blend these colours together that I've put on, blend them all together and hopefully have a lot of precision as well and a lot of control. Now you can alternate between perhaps a different kind of brush, maybe a synthetic brush. You will see me use a synthetic brush later on when I'm doing some of the bigger petals because I just find it's a really, really good brush for blending together a lot of colour and a lot of water quickly, especially when you're using watercolour pencils. But for the slightly smaller petals, you can see me using the Sable brush, the size 3, and it works absolutely brilliantly. And you can see me moving the water around, blending all of those colours together, and then just gently brushing some of that darker colour along the edges and also down towards the lighter area, but still trying to keep that bit light. So I've done that small petal. It's time to move on to one next door to it. And this one is a little bit more complex in terms of the light areas and dark areas. So I'm going to go in with exactly the same colours and exactly the same technique. I've started with my lightest, going through the mid-tones to the darkest. And you can see I've popped up another photo on the screen. And the very central petal that has almost got a point that's going up towards, say, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, that is the one that you can see me adding colour to right now, and now about to add some of the water to. So I'm starting in the dark area of this leaf and I'm blending that, mixing that up, and then dragging that colour up, and then you can see me work back down again. So I kind of start in the light area with the water and work down into the shadow areas and the dark colour, because what I'm trying to do is keep it nice and dark near the bottom where the petal is coming out from the flower, where there's a lot of shadow. So I want to keep that bit nice and dark. So that's why I started in the light area and worked back down into the dark area. Here you can see me start in the light area again and move again down into the dark area of the petal. So I'm hopefully, once I blend all those lovely dark colours, I'm keeping them mainly in the part where I need them to be dark, which is down near the bottom of the petal. It is a bit of a balancing act going between the light areas and the dark areas and trying to get them to stay light or dark. So what I do have is I have a big wad of tissue paper right next to me on the desk, and anytime I think the colour is getting too dark in there, I quickly put my brush in the water, swizzle it around, dampen it on the tissue paper just gently, and then I get back into the picture and I try and maybe blend that area, make it lighter, or lift a little bit of colour up on my brush and take that away and rinse again. So I'm constantly looking at the balance of dark and light and seeing if I can control it a little bit better, and using the tissue and perhaps a clean brush is the best way that I've found. So now I've shown you a couple of sequences in real time. I switched to doing time-lapse sections now, but slow enough that you can still see what I'm doing pretty clearly. So again, here you can see me now moving out. I'm doing the center of the flower first, which might seem a bit unusual. You might think that I should have started on the far left petal and worked my way across, but again, that was kind of dictated by me wanting to do a small petal first of all, just to check everything was okay before I moved on to the rest of the flower. And because I started near the center, it just seemed like a good idea to then try and do all of the center as well. There's also quite a lot of dark shadow areas that need to be done in the center where the petals are very small and they haven't quite sort of moved up and hit the light yet. So you can see me working quite a lot here, using quite a lot of the blue, the spectrum blue and the blue grey within the colouring here to try and keep the colours as dark as possible. And the succulent was a real blend of sort of blues and greens, so I'm constantly throughout doing the picture trying to make sure I get a good balance of the blues and the greens in each of the petals so that some don't look too green and that some don't look too blue. It is, again, I mentioned a balancing act a couple of minutes ago. It's a balancing act, and I don't think that I get it all completely spot on, and some of the petals end up looking a bit more green and some of the petals end up looking a bit more blue. But that is a sort of artistic picture. It's going to have fluctuations. If it was done by a robot, I'm sure it would be like 100% accurate. Slight video issue here as the arm holding the camera suddenly falls, but it's okay. It was absolutely fine, and I was able to just continue with the petal. And there's a couple of things to mention here about each petal that I'm doing. You'll notice that I don't cover the entire petal with colour when I'm laying down the watercolour pencils, and there are two reasons for that. Number one reason is fairly simply the edge of each of these petals on a succulent has got almost a sort of glowy white edge, which looks absolutely brilliant when you're painting it, and it helps you see the edges of each of the petals, so it provides a really nice contrast. So that's one of the reasons I'm not filling the entire petal with colour. The other one is, of course, if I put on enough colour, then when I add the water and I start blending it and moving it around with the brush, I can push it with the brush where I want it to go. So I don't have to colour the entire petal with colour, because I can move that colour into areas where I want it to go. It also allows me to keep some areas very, very pale. If I was doing a normal watercolour painting with, pans or tubes of watercolour, I would be leaving white areas as bright white highlights because it just looks really, really good. And also in watercolour, you've kind of got to do that from the start. When I'm using the watercolour pencils, I'm still moving that colour into these areas that I've left white, but as you can see, it's got a really lovely, almost translucent, pale quality to it, which was important because the succulent had that kind of quality on the petals as well. Some of the colours are strong, but mostly they almost appear to be a kind of a pastel kind of shade. You might also be watching this and think, well, why doesn't he just put down a lot more colour straight away? He's actually putting it on quite lightly to begin with. And the reason, and if you've watched one of my other watercolour pencil videos, you know is that I have a problem with the more colour you add with watercolour pencils. There's a sort of greasy quality I find when you start to then blend all of that pigment that you've put onto the paper together, and it's not a particularly nice look that I find in the painting. So I usually try to put on a bit less of the watercolour pencils, thinking I can add some later on. So that's why I don't put it on quite as dark and quite as thick as you might expect me to. Now, you might have noticed at the start of the video I mentioned I'm using hot press paper this time. The reason for that is when I was using cold press, I loved the way the pencils reacted on it, but of course cold press usually has a slightly rough texture quality to it, which is not ideal when you're trying to draw on with pencils and make pencil lines. So I thought I'd switch up to a much smoother paper, which I know that hot press is, before I started doing this picture. But I had reservations there because hot press paper has always been my nemesis when I have been doing regular watercolor pictures. I just couldn't find a way to make it work, and I did find I was reminded of that doing this picture. It's the fact that hot press paper seems to give you less time to blend the colors on the surface. It almost looks like it's one of those papers that's designed for watercolorists that slap on a big blob of paint, move it around with a brush quickly, and then they're on to the next one, because I found that it was already kind of staining into the paper, sitting into the paper. Even if I just took a brush, dabbed it in some water and came back to try and blend a little bit of color, it was already beginning to kind of sit and stain within the paper. So I love the fact that it was smooth to work on. I thought that was brilliant. But, if you guys use hot press paper and you can give me any kind of advice on how to use it and the differences, coping with the differences between this and cold press paper, which seems to give you so much longer to blend on and work with, then please leave a comment below. Give me as much advice and help as possible to deal with the whole hot press paper issue that I have. Now my first pass at the entire succulent is almost done, so it's time to have a little sit back and a check. So here you can see me comparing the photo reference I'm using to the actual succulent I've painted, and what I'm pointing out here is areas that I have not done dark enough in terms of the shadows. So I can see quite clearly, in order to give it a bit more depth to this picture, I need to do that. Then you see me flick to just a black and white image, which sometimes if you can't see the shadows in colour, black and white makes it a bit clearer. So here you can see me, I've sharpened my watercolour pencils up again, and I'm going in and I'm just sort of smart adding some little shadows here and there, darkening some shadows. And luckily, like I said, the hot press paper kind of makes the colours sit into the paper a little bit. So that made me less worried of putting extra colour on here and blending it all over again. Because usually with watercolours, you're worried about blending an extra layer you put on top with the layer underneath. But because of the way that hot press seemed to be working, I really wasn't worried about that happening here. So there's the final shadows, and it's time to have a look at them side by side. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. I think it should have been a bit more blue, but I love the fact that I did the outlines with watercolor pencil rather than graphite. I think it's given it a totally different look. And the hot press paper, I'm just going to have to get better with that. If you want to watch one of my previous watercolor pencil videos, there's links on the screen and below. And don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell, maybe give me a share or a like, and thank you for watching.